Welcome to Property Insurance Claims Fraud Review. My name is Greg Stafford. I'm a multi-line, multi-state licensed insurance claim adjuster, as well as a certified construction project manager. I've been involved in the industries of construction and insurance claim adjusting for nearly 3 decades. In this video, I'm going to be discussing an issue that's coming up more and more frequently, in California in particular, but also in other states. And that is whether or not repair estimates for covered claims should include a separate line item within the body of the estimate for a project manager or a job supervisor. Or does the general overhead allowance typically added at the end of a repair estimate include the company's project management or supervisory costs? Let me share with you a few notes that will help explain the situation from the perspective of actual claims. These are notes from estimates, different estimates from different counties in California that all make the claim for supervision or project manager as a separate line item within the body of an estimate. Like here, you can see separated by the dark line different notes. The first of which has a 2 by it because in the estimate that I took it from, it's the second line item. It shows residential supervision project management for 80 hours. And then in the note field below, it says supervision is required by CSLB, which is the Contractor State License Board. Required by CSLB license requirement that licensee or manager inspect every job site each day until complete. Supervision is not, according to this note, covered in Xactimate overhead and profit, according to Xactimate white pages. So the question I just posed a moment ago as to whether or not project management or job supervision should be included as a separate line item or considered part of the general overhead operating costs of the company is directly addressed by these notes here in the negative. It states supervision is not covered in overhead and profit, which would include the general overhead category amount that we're distinguishing from line items like this here. This note has a line item. This is not the general overhead categorical allowance, which you can see here as part of another estimate. This is the summary of the totals in a repair estimate where you have general contractor overhead, and it is in this case 10% of the estimate total, and then you have general contractor profit. We're focusing on overhead here and whether or not general overhead and this amount here would include project management or supervision costs. According to this line item that I took from an estimate that was submitted as part of a claim on behalf of an insured, it states that supervision is required and that it's not covered in the Xactimate overhead and profit according to what it refers to as Xactimate's white pages. And that's actually a reference to what Xactimate issues as white papers, or articles that explain their position on various subjects, one of which we'll get to further in a moment. But in addition, the note goes on to describe the type of work that it's claiming here in this separate line item as being first to allow subcontractors into the site and then to return to check and secure the site. The note then goes further and cites the California Administrative Code, Title 16, Section 823, parentheses A, quoting, direct supervision and control includes any one or any combination of the following activities. Following's misspelled, but it's from an actual estimate, so that's just the way it is. But it's quoting or referring to this source here in what it says, and says direct supervision and control includes these activities: supervising construction, managing construction activities, by making technical and administrative decisions, by checking job for proper workmanship, or direct supervision on construction job sites. So this note states that this source, California Admin Code, provides this definition of supervision and control, which is required by the CSLB, but not included in O&P, or overhead and profit. So before we consider further whether or not that's the case, in addition to the description of work that's claimed as part of this line item, which is just to allow subcontractors into the site and to return to check and secure the site, this note here, which doesn't have the extended information that we'll get to in that note and that you see in part here, this note nonetheless claims supervision as a separate line item, 160 hours, stating that the construction supervisor is required for coordination, permits, interfacing with policyholder or insured, workers, city, ordering materials, scheduling, site access, and so forth. As we're going to see, these are all expected supervisor tasks or activities. And the question is whether or not they should be listed separately in terms of the cost allocation, as we see here and here, or whether or not they should be included in the general overhead allowance listed at the end of estimates like here. So taking a look further at a couple more notes, here's a different note from a different estimate, but it basically has exactly the same information. It refers to the CSLB requirements. It states supervision is not covered in Xactimate's O&P. It adds the apostrophe between the E and the S in Xactimate showing possession, which we didn't get here. But otherwise, it's pretty much the exact same preliminary wording and information. Same description of work being claimed to allow subcontractors into the site and to return to check and secure the site. And then you see again here the citation of the California Administrative Code, Title 16, Section 823A, gives the definition in quotes of direct supervision and control, just like you see here in this note from a different estimate. And this estimate goes a little further and cites Section 7068. Doesn't state of what, but it's from the California Business and Professions Code, as we'll get to further in a moment. It does refer to Section 7068.1 here, and it does include reference to the Business and Professions Code. We'll see why, as I mentioned, in a moment. But at least there is further reference in this note. In addition to the reference to Xactimate's white paper and the California Administrative Code. Taking a look a little bit further at a couple of final notes. These are both additional notes, meaning they're not from the same estimates that these notes are from. But as you can see, the opening wording is pretty much exactly the same as two of the three prior notes that we reviewed, in stating that supervision is not covered in Xactimate's O&P, according to the white paper. Defines what they're charging for as allowing subcontractors into the site, return to check and secure the site, excuse me. And then you get reference again to California Administrative Code, Title 16, Section 823, parentheses A, with the direct supervision and control definition, including all these activities. You get the same thing here in this note. So this is what we're talking about. This is really what's at issue. Should we be including line items like we just reviewed from real estimates and real claims that I handled involving thousands of additional dollars, tens of thousands of additional dollars for project management and supervision? Is that the right way to do it, to list it separately like that and to cite supporting authority? Well, it's always good to cite supporting authority, but it's also important that you look up the authority that's cited. So let's go ahead and do that and take a look first at the authority cited first in the note after referencing the Xactimate white paper. This is the California Code of Regulations, the more common reference, inclusive of the California Administrative Code, that you see here in these notes, but it's the same reference. Title 16, Section 823. You'll see that the wording is the same, but there is one difference. Whereas in all four of these notes, 4 of the 5 notes cited here that are basically the same and that all refer to this as the source of their authority, Title 16, Section 823A. When we go to the California Code of Regulations, Section 823, Title 16, it's not Section A, where the information that is quoted, direct supervision and control includes any one or any combination of the following activities, followed by a listing of those activities. It's not Section 823A, where this information in all 4 of these notes is found. It's in subsection B. And notice right before the wording we're talking about that's quoted in these notes from real claims, different estimates in different counties on different days that all are saying the same thing, they're all referring to the wrong section of the California Code of Regulations. They refer to subsection A, where it defines a bona fide employee as a permanent employee of the applicant, in this case, applicant for a building contracting company. But subsection B states, for purposes of section 7068.1 of the code, in this case the Business and Professions Code, cited as the authority down here, for purposes of section 7068.1 of the code, quote, direct supervision and control includes any one or any combination of the following activities: supervising construction, managing construction activities by making technical and administrative decisions, checking jobs for proper workmanship, or direct supervision on job sites. Now notice, for purposes of section 7068.1 of the Business and Professions Code, that's what this is. That's the authority for this part of the California Code of Regulations pertaining to direct supervision and control of the applicant's, as you're going to see, operations. Let's go to the California Business and Professions Code, section 7068.1 that was just referenced in the California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Section 823B, not A, as is erroneously referenced in all 4 of these notes, making claims for tens of thousands of dollars, in some cases a little less, but aggregately tens of thousands of dollars for additional line item supervision as if it's not covered in Xactimate's overhead and profit. According to the Business and Professions Code, which is the basis or the authority for Title 16, Section 823B, the person qualifying on behalf of an individual or firm shall be responsible for exercising that direct supervision and control of his or her employer's or principal's construction operations to secure compliance with this chapter and the rules and regulations of the board. And then it goes on to talk about different qualifications, limitations, and then in subsection D of section 7068.1 of the BPC, Business and Professions Code, it states, the board shall require every applicant or licensee qualifying by the appearance of a qualifying individual to submit detailed information on the qualifying individual's duties and responsibilities for supervision and control of the applicant's construction operations. This has to be done before there's even a project for the company to work on, before there's even a license granted to the applicant. There has to be a qualified person handling the duties and responsibilities of supervision and control of the applicant's construction operations. And notice again, this is in the section 7068.1 of the BPC, subsection A specifically states that the qualifying person is responsible for direct supervision and control of his or her employer's or principal's construction operations. Just as you see down here under subsection D. In fact, it states there has to be a detailed description of the supervisor's, the qualifying person's duties and responsibilities to supervise and control the construction operations. It's not talking about a specific project or job here, because there is no specific project or job here yet. This is what is required in order to qualify for a license to then get a job that you can supervise. And so if we go back to the California Code of Regulations, you can see that the proper reference in subsection B is clearly associating, in fact linking as the basis for authority, these supervision activities, which are very broad and inclusive, certainly of everything that we read described in these notes, which was just to allow subcontractors into the site to return and secure the site. And the most descriptive note was just to coordinate the project permits, interface with the owner, the workers, city, ordering materials. These are all basic supervisor construction activities. As you can see here, direct supervision and control includes supervising construction. That's very broad. Managing construction activities by making technical decisions, obviously interfacing with whomever has a question or a need, and administrative decisions. Checking jobs for proper workmanship or direct supervision on construction job sites, being on site and handling matters, making sure the project stays on schedule or doing what is necessary to account for any situations that arise. So this activity is directly related to section 7068.1 of the Business and Professions Code, right here, which is talking about someone being qualified for the applicant before they ever even have a job that the company can run, to be responsible for supervising and controlling the applicant's construction operations. And a detailed description of the activities has to be submitted. So every building contractor in the state of California has to have on file a description of the supervisor's activities before they even have a job, to which they might attribute any additional costs. But there are certain activities, like we're reading about right here, that they have to be paying for to be done on every job. It's just that some jobs, as we're going to discuss further in a moment, involve more than your normal tasks. These are the normal required tasks that a project manager or supervisor in California has to provide as part of the operations of the company. Supervise construction, manage construction, make technical and administrative decisions, check jobs for proper workmanship, or directly supervise construction job sites. All of that is expected work that a project manager provides to a general building contractor on every job. Now let's take a look at the other source that was cited as a basis for authority in these notes for adding supervision as a separate line item like you see here, versus considering it included in the general overhead listed at the end of an estimate like here. So if we go back to those notes, we've already talked about how every single one of these notes that include this extended description miscite the California Code of Regulations, and the actual reference ties directly to the Business and Professions Code, which speaks specifically to the operations the applicant's construction operations before there's ever even a job. And so that appears clear that there's both a misreference here and a misapplication of the proper reference in Section 823B. Because here it is making the case that it's not included in overhead and profit, yet Section 68.1 specifically links the construction operations preceding any actual job with the direct supervision and control costs that have to be incurred to qualify for a license. All right, so then those notes, in addition to misciting California Administrative Code and misapplying the proper reference and failing to really get into the significance of the Business and Professions Code Section 7068.1, dealing specifically with operational costs, states that supervision is not covered in O&P according to Xactimate's white pages. Really what is meant, again, is white paper, specifically this white paper. As you can see, white paper over here next to overhead. This is the latest iteration of this white paper, February 5th, 2020. It's basically the same in all critical respects to prior iterations. And here it states on page 2, general overhead are expenses incurred by a general contractor that cannot be attributed to individual projects and include any and all expenses necessary for the general contractor to operate their business. So right here we can see in the white paper referenced in all of the 4 notes with the extended information cited to support the claim for additional supervision costs outside of the general overhead allowance. That white paper defines general overhead here as costs that cannot be attributed to a project, an individual project, but that are necessary to operate the business. That's exactly what the California Business and Professions Code is talking about here in Section 7068.1, because these are the requirements that have to be in place, namely a qualifying individual or applicant, to secure compliance with this chapter and the rules and regulations of the board, is specifically speaking to the construction operational costs that have to be incurred before there's even a project. So there's no way that what the Xactimate white paper is talking about in terms of general overhead could be, there's no way it could be excluding what we're reading about supervision in the California Code of Regulations and in its cited authority, the Business and Professions Code, because these are construction operation costs before there's even a project to attribute them to. So when the Xactimate white paper says these are expenses you can't attribute to a project, this is what it's talking about. Construction operation costs. And that's why the Xactimate white paper explicitly states their expenses necessary for the operation of the business. All right, so if Xactimate's white paper here states that general overhead includes operational costs that can't be attributed to a specific project, and if the Business and Professions Code defines supervision as it relates to Title 16 of the California Code of Regulations, Section 823A and B, if the Business and Professions Code links those supervision activities with operational costs, and if the Xactware white paper states that operational costs are general overhead, why do these notes state that supervision is not covered in overhead and profit according to Xactimate's white pages? It's because of this section right here. just below general overhead in the Xactimate white paper, overhead and profit, on page 2, it states job-related overhead are expenses that can be attributed to a project, but cannot be attributed to a specific task. So note the difference here. There's this job-related overhead category of expenses that you can, in contrast to general overhead, attribute to a project. But you cannot attribute them to specific tasks. And then it gives examples, including but not limited to project managers, on-site portable offices and restroom facilities, temporary power, fencing, security, if needed. So just like you don't need a guard for every construction project, you have to make sure the site's secure, but you don't need the extent of hiring a security guard for every project. But if you do need a security guard because it's a special condition, it wouldn't be considered as part of the operational costs, right? Because you can attribute it to a project. The project requires a security guard. But that's not what's required for every job to operate the business. So in the same way, if a project manager is required because of a specific project, not just to operate the business, which is the case according to the California Code of Regulations and Section 7068(1) of the Business and Professions Code, a supervisor is required for the construction operations, direct supervision and control, qualifying person. But if the activities that are included in what is described as required supervision activity to operate your business, namely supervising construction, managing construction, if this is not enough to account for what a job requires a supervisor to complete, then you would add a separate line item, like in these estimates, to account for the additional unanticipated work of the project manager, because this is all anticipated. This is all required to be done, and the cost to get it done incurred by the applicant before they even have a job. But if this is not enough, if you have a job, for example, that has very unusual access, site access, and you need a project manager pretty much the whole time just to make sure the workers for the different subcontractors get to the site right and know where to park and don't have problems with the surroundings because of the unique conditions, then that's something that's not accounted for in what general building contractors already tell the California State Licensing Board they have a supervisor ready to do before they even have a job to work on. Once they get a job to work on, if that job requires more than these activities here, then that's what is meant in the Xactimate white paper by adding this expense as a separate line item. It's not excluding supervision or a project manager from general overhead. The definition of general overhead given in this white paper is clearly fitting for the definition of the required supervision and control of an applicant's construction operations, not a specific project, which hasn't even been signed yet. So when you have a situation, if it's needed, you can add a separate line item, as in these cases, in addition to the overhead allowance, commonly added at the end of an estimate. But this type of note is not necessary for the activities cited incorrectly, but correctly provided here in the California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Section 823B, as it pertains to Section 7068(1) of the Business and Professions Code, direct supervision and control. Quotes from right here related to this, not related to a project. It's related, according to the code, to the construction operations before there's even a project that this could apply to, job-related overhead. But if there is a job that comes up and it involves more supervision or project management work than is anticipated in what is required by the California Code of Regulations definition of supervision activities and construction activities, then you can go ahead and do, as the Xactimate white paper states, add supervision or project manager as a separate line item for the number of hours necessary to account for the unique condition. And notice here, in addition to differentiating between expenses you can attribute to a project, like supervision you don't anticipate, and expenses that you cannot attribute to an individual project, right? Like the cost you have to incur before you even get a license in order to have a supervisor prepared to handle all of these operational activities. Notice that in addition to that, it states it cannot be attributed to a specific task. That is the separate line item for supervision that you see in these examples here. This cannot be attributed to a task. And yet, in the note, it states that the claim is made for allowing subcontractors to the site to return and check and secure the site, just like the other notes did that have this extended reference and support cited. But the definition of operational supervision includes much more than that, much more than just letting subcontractors into the site and checking and securing the site. Supervising the construction, that's checking on the site. That's making sure people can get into the site. Managing construction by making technical and administrative decisions. How people are going to get into the site. Who's going to let them in the site. Who secures the site. Checking the jobs. Direct supervision. These are very broad and inclusive categories that certainly would include the description cited in these notes of checking, securing the site. This is not even this note here that didn't go in the extended support citations, but that provide a little more description of the work. This is all included in the California Code of Regulations Title 16. Coordinate, plans, permits, interfacing with policyholder, working with the city, ordering materials. These are all basic and expected construction supervisor activities or tasks. And further on this, let's take a quick look at what is stated in the AGC Supervisory Training Program, Volume 4, which was part of the instruction manuals that I used through my certification at San Diego State's Construction Supervisory Program for project managers. On page 517, under Managing General Conditions, it states in summary, note that authority and responsibility will vary from company to company and from supervisor to supervisor. Analyze the tasks that you perform. Determine which you perform by virtue of delegated authority and which you carry out because it is your responsibility to do so. This is how you can analyze the limits and the bounds of the daily tasks you are expected to perform. And this is how you can be more certain of the authority and responsibility of others. In this way, you can avoid stepping on other people's toes or failing to perform an expected task because of not knowing whose task it was. One final suggestion: when in doubt, ask. So going back to the Xactimate white paper, job-related overhead are expenses that can be attributed to a project. They're not operational costs you have to incur before you get a license or a job to work on. These supervision activities are. And they cannot supervision that is a separate line item in addition to the general overhead allowance, like you see here. That kind of supervision that's added as separate line items, like in these examples here, cannot be attributed to a specific task. Well, as we learned in our construction supervisory course related to project management certification, we are expected to perform certain tasks on a daily basis as construction supervisors. And those tasks are specifically described right here in the California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Section 823B, not Section 823A, and they are related to the Business and Professions Code, which specifically has to do with pre-licensing qualifications for applicants and the direct supervision and control that they will have over their construction operations, not over a project they don't even have yet. So in every way, the notes that we reviewed and that are being used regularly to claim tens of thousands of dollars on property claims in California and in other states, the information in the notes we reviewed and that is being used by others consistently, right, they were basically all the same, even in their mistakes. The information that's being used miscites the California Code of Regulations and misapplies it in support of separately listing project management or job supervision costs as if they're not costs that are included in the construction operation of the company, when in fact the very source that was quoted but not properly cited in all of those notes that we reviewed relies on the Business and Professions Code, Section 7068.1, that deals explicitly with the pre-licensing requirements, the pre-job requirements of an applicant for direct supervision and control of that applicant's operations, not a specific project. So the notes that are being used miscite the California Code of Regulations, misapply the California Code of Regulations, don't really even attempt to apply the Business and Professions Codes that are the basis for the authority of the Code of Regulations that are cited, and misapplies the Xactware white paper on overhead and profit, which specifically excludes normal supervisory tasks like those described in the California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Section 823B. The white paper that is cited in those notes specifically excludes those tasks and states that if you're going to list supervision or project management as a separate line item in the body of a repair estimate, like we saw done in those examples, if you're going to do that, it has to be attributable to a project, not to the operations of the company, to which all of the described activities in the California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Section 823B apply. They're costs that are expended to the operation of the company in order to qualify as an applicant and to then provide not on just one project but on all projects the required direct control and supervision. But where that's not enough, where the conditions of a specific project, right, just like it says here, that can be attributed to a project but not normal tasks. If there are expenses that go beyond those tasks and that are due to a specific project, not the operations of the company, then you can add that cost as a separate line item in the body of an estimate, like in these examples, versus considering it included as part of the general overhead allowance at the end of an estimate, as in this example. So I hope this video regarding job supervision and project management claims that may or may not be fraud as it pertains to property insurance claims in California and other states has been helpful to you. And I hope it gives you a good basis so that you can then better determine whether or not to pay or cover a separate line item within the body of an estimate for supervision or project management. Again, if it's necessary because of a specific project and not inclusive of normal required tasks that a supervisor or project manager has to perform on every project, then you could consider adding an additional allowance for a job supervisor in addition to the general overhead. But if it's not, if it's a task that is expected to be completed by the project manager because of the qualifications and requirements in order for the general building contractor to have the license in the first place, then you shouldn't pay the additional supervision claimed. As to whether or not it's fraud, that's a more complex question. It may or it may not be. It may be a situation where an adjuster just doesn't have as much familiarity or knowledge of construction operating costs, and so may have been told by a contractor that this is necessary. But as we have shown, in California, to become a licensed contractor, you not only have to know that you're required to provide supervision as part of your operational costs, you have to have a qualifying person. And then you have to submit a detailed description of the duties and responsibilities related to the supervision that will be provided operationally before you even have a job. So we know then that contractors who are making claims for project management or job supervision as a separate line item versus as part of their operational costs, we know it's more likely that they're committing fraud because they already would have to know the description of the work required before they even have a project to which they could attribute those required supervision costs. And so unless they're able to show why a specific project and not required daily supervisor tasks should be included as a separate line item, then that separate line item should be denied. And it should be explained that general overhead, at least in the state of California, includes as part of its operational costs the supervision described in the California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Section 823B. And if they incorrectly reference that section, point it out to them. Point out the connection. The California Business and Professions Code, Section 7068.1, and how it directly links the supervision activities in the California Code of Regulations with the construction operations of the applicant in the Business and Professions Code. Additionally, you can cite the Xactimate white paper to show that it specifies general overhead as operational costs, which is exactly what the Business and Professions Code says the California Code of Regulations supervising activity descriptions are. And so, unless there's something special that we can attribute to the project, no additional supervision as a separate line item above and beyond the general overhead allowance, which includes the required supervising activities, is going to be provided.